Welcome to a series of 5 lectures on American exceptionalism and American identity, delivered at the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute in Eugene, Oregon, in January and February of 2019. Welcome to a series of 5 lectures on American exceptionalism and American identity, delivered at the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute in Eugene, Oregon, in January and February of 2019. Here's our cast. Max Weber, Hegel, and a whole bunch of other people. Max Weber on modern versus traditional, Hegel on new ways to be an individual, and brief appearances by Lee Greenwood, Huck Finn, Walt Rostow, Susie Hansen, Wittgenstein, Ayn Rand, the Internationale, and others. Now you might ask, why no Plato? Because I do so much with Plato here. The reason is this is really going beyond him. This is going to a kind of society he couldn't imagine and wouldn't have liked if he could. Am I going to give you practical advice on how to handle our current day political messes? Sorry, no. Philosophical advice, yes. Make some distinctions, revise some concepts, make you think the questions differently so maybe you have new options when you come to make your practical decision. You'll see what this means as we go along. Here's the program of the lectures as I envision it. We start out with America and freedom. We link that to the notion of modernity. And we use Weber, Max Weber, the German sociologist, to talk about 2 kinds of rationality, which allows him to distinguish a traditional from a modern society. Then we look at some things that say modernity, yeah. Then we look at some things that say modernity, oh shit. Right. And then we ask, we don't want to get caught between that yeah and that oh shit. We want to find out what's wrong with the concepts we're using that push us into that dichotomy. So we'll revise those concepts. That's where we'll bring Hegel in. And then we'll apply all this to America using Huck Finn, America the Beautiful, universal versus particular identities, and the issue of multiculturalism. So that's the program, 5 lectures. Where the lectures break, I'm not sure. It depends how much we get done. We'll see. This part is accordion. It can be made shorter or longer, depending where we get to. Well, let's talk about American exceptionalism for a minute. America is different. We've been told that. Many of us believe it. Others hate it. They think, oh no. I'm saying don't condemn it or accept it too quickly because there's some issues here that need examination. Many groups proclaim that they're different. The Romans said they were different. The Chinese certainly think they're different. Every society thinks that it's special. Why should Americans think that their being exceptional is important? But Americans claim to be exceptionally exceptional. Right? We're the new game in town, at least we were in 1776. We were the nation that did new things, a new kind of freedom. We weren't the only one. The French did it too, and everyone ignores the fact that the Haitians, the slaves in Haiti had a very successful revolution of their own, which of course they weren't supposed to. So we're claiming to be unusual, to bring something new, something modern. We're open, we're democratic, we're tolerant, and we're secular. To which the response is, oh, wait a minute, look at American history. How secular were they? The Pilgrims, not at all. How open were they? They were fighting against the Catholics and certainly didn't treat the slaves well. I mean, yeah, they're democratic up to a point. They're tolerant within narrow limits. So, hey, come on. The real history is not like that ideal. But that open, democratic, tolerant, and secular is what people hoped we would be. It's what we told ourselves we would be. Granted, people didn't define it perhaps as widely as they should. Then the response is, well, whatever it was supposed to be, it was betrayed because it was flawed, or it was capitalist, or it was imperialistic, or it was misogynist, or misoga, whatever. All those terrible things. My response is, maybe so, but it's a complex story. We need to look more closely at this claimed difference, this claimed freedom. We need to find a new version of those old ideals, freed from abstract individualism. That doesn't mean much yet, but it will after a while. And freed from any easy equation with capitalism, and not hemmed in by the old dualities. We're going to find some new concepts, in other words. Keywords will be freedom and modern. The issues for me are, is modern identity empty, in the philosophical jargon, formal? And are selves and identities single ply? That's really the major thing. Philosophical jargon from Hegel, immediacy. Those words won't mean much yet, but you'll hear them too much. And I have a thesis to push. The debates about American identity have been distorted by two conceptual errors. One is that our identities are single ply. You have an identity, there it is. I'm a Catholic, I'm an Italian, I'm what have you. And the other, that modern freedom brings a separation of form from content. Again, that will get clarified shortly. So I'm going to argue against those two things to try and produce a different version of what we might think of as an American identity. Okay? That's the program. Take our proud, we're an American hat on. We're the free people. We're the new individuals. The modern people. Freed from traditional restraints. The errors of the Enlightenment. Well, what does that mean? I mean, those are things you've heard, right? Here's words to a Lee Greenwood song. I was going to play it, but it's hard to get the YouTube up without commercials. Right? If tomorrow all the things were gone I worked for all my life and I had to start again with just my children and my wife, that's the sort of Western image, right? It's just us and the world. We're facing it by ourselves. I'm John Wayne, right? I thank my lucky stars to be living here today because the flag still stands for freedom and they can't take that away. Which is odd because they just did. They took away everything. Yeah. And I'm proud to be an American where at least I know I'm free. So he's claiming that the distinctive feature of being an American is to be free. And I won't forget the men who died who gave that right to me. Well, that's wrong. If you're really free, nobody gave you that right. You have it. They could defend the right. That's different. And I'll gladly stand up next to you and defend her, America, today, because there ain't no doubt I love this land. God bless the USA. And if this is a song that gets played a lot. Freedom. That's what we've got left if you take everything away, he's saying. Freedom. This is Google freedom, go to the images section, you get images like this. And what they all have are breaking chains, breaking restraints. Or here's another one. Freedom is being you without anyone's permission. Which raises the question, freedom from something? Freedom for something? What does it mean? Now, we have a caution here. The scientists will step up and say, you can talk all you want about freedom, but physics says you're completely determined. Every little atom is moving, bouncing on other atoms. So forget this talk about freedom. Or the theologian will say, you may talk about freedom, but God knows how you're going to decide. So forget all this worry about freedom. Now, the strange thing about what the scientist and the theologian would say is it's irrelevant, because you still have to decide who to vote for. You still have to decide what policy the city council is going to adopt on taxation. The practical questions don't go away. Whether from some distant theological or scientific point of view there's no freedom, it doesn't help you in the practical daily life. Because as a practical daily life, you still have to make a decision. Well, you can say, I won't make a decision. That is a decision. Right? So you can't avoid the practice of freedom, whether or not, from some abstract, distant point of view, there is no such thing. And so this, as I say, is curiously irrelevant. I mean, fascinating philosophical issue, but curiously irrelevant to everyday life. So here's a question. Does more freedom mean more choices? And that, think back to the Lee Greenwood song. Everything's been taken away, but he's still free. But he isn't free to do very much because he doesn't have his property anymore. He's just got his wife and kids. He's out on the, you imagine him out in the West, what do we do now? Where's water? So freedom is a funny word because freedom may be the freedom to be you, but on the other hand, being you may be very restricted by circumstances. And those pictures of chains breaking are not just about permission, they're also about having options available in your circumstance, in your society. Who has the most choices? Now, one answer that you could give for that is modern people have more choices. And that's what we're going to pursue. Now, what do you mean by modern? The word modern is an interesting one. It's actually an old Latin word, but it was coined rather late in the Middle Ages. And it comes from a word that means today. So in its original meaning, it just meant what's going on today as opposed to what went on yesterday. But it got picked up, especially in France, with a separate meaning, which was, we are doing something entirely new. The quarrel of the ancients and the moderns was the phrase they used. The classical people and us moderns who are doing new things. This is prior to the revolution even. So that the second connotation of the word modern is not just today, but the today is different. And in not just different the way the 17th century was from the 16th century, but different in some more fundamental way. Differently different. Exceptionally exceptional. Right? Now, of course, the word modern doesn't always mean that. But in this context, I'm using it that way. And now we tie them together. Modernity means freedom. Circulation let loose. Commodities can circulate freely. You're not restricted to what your caste is allowed to buy. You're not restricted to what the church will say you can or can't buy. It's let loose, the circulation of commodities and of technology and ideas, spreading them about. Autonomous individual with more choices because restrictions have been removed. In contrast to that, we think of a traditional society as a kind of regulated set of exchanges. You're a shoemaker. You get your materials from X, you sell your stuff to Y, and you don't break out of that channel because someone else has another channel. And you're not an entrepreneur who can create something new. One of the crucial modernizing things was when people in Italy and Germany began to find ways to create new modes of circulation of money, new modes for the creation of organizations. But if you think about a sort of traditional society, there's no room for that. Everybody has posts and fixed roles. That brings us to Max Weber. Okay? Now, who is Max Weber? The founder of sociology, people would say. Notice that he lived until 1920, though he did most of his important work before and around the First World War. He's author of many, many, many things, and in fact his thinking is not completely consistent. But what I want to follow is his distinction between modern and traditional society, because this will give some body to the claim about a special new kind of freedom. For Weber, the modern individual is stripped down. A core of freedom that makes choices for whatever they want. That's the crucial thing. There's no restriction on their goal. They can maximize whatever they want. They're choosing among the very widest possibilities because nothing is telling them those possibilities are out of possibility. In Weber's eyes, this is not just a new kind of society. This is saying what society was all along about. It always was about individuals making their choices. But tradition, religion, other things made them not see the fact that it all depended on their individual choices. Modernity unveiled what's been at the root of everything. That's what makes it exceptionally exceptional, differently different. It's showing you what's been going on all along. It's taking away the blinders and the walls. Now, he does this in terms of all things of rationality. Why rationality? I thought we were talking about choice. Well, rationality is basically system construction for Weber. If you're arguing, you're following rules of logic. You're not just spouting sentences at random. The sentences connect with one another. They make a system. They give you a firm place to stand. If you're thinking, you want to have your thoughts consigned this way so that they're systematic, consistent, and effective. So the one thing you're trying to do doesn't get in the way of something else you're trying to do. It also means consistency in linking your actions. Means to end. So that's rationality for him. Basically, the opposite of rationality is random activity, random talking. Nobody does that. Animals don't do it. Right? Then he distinguishes formal from substantive rationality. A system with substantive rationality has got content. That's what it means. Contentful rationality. Restricts your possibilities because it enforces norms based on beliefs about the structure of the world. Values and roles that can't be questioned because they are cosmically given, or they come from God, or they've been given to us by our ancestors, or whatever. But in any case, there they are, and you have to live them. He thinks of the example would be the Indian caste system. Complicated system, historically arose for a variety of reasons as a way of incorporating tribal groups into the culture. Or a traditional village would be another example. Think of a traditional village, whether there are any, I don't know, but anthropologists describe them this way. The house is set up so that this is the women's quarter, this is the men's quarter. And the village is designed so that the temple is at this end, and the various subgroups of the society have their little shrine. So when you walk around the village, the layout speaks the world to you. It tells you the social roles, the paths you are to follow. So the whole thing is a seamless whole. Now, whether this ever existed is an interesting question. We'll come back to it later. But the ideal is that the whole world, the art, the religion, the architecture, the symbols, the stories, enforce a certain view which defines who you can be. A substantive rational system is not to be judged against other possible goals that we might have. Why? Because the substantive rational system tells you what your goals are. It tells you who you are. So you can't question it without losing your identity, feeling lost. A substantive rational system seems natural, true, there in the world. That's what Weber is saying. I'm going to say, well, truth is, they aren't always there. But in any case, so here's what Weber seems to be thinking. A tribal member living according to values inscribed in the cosmos, in the village layout, versus a modern person who makes decisions pragmatically to maximize whatever they damn well want. Choose your own lifestyle. Very different image. The point I want to make is historical examples of pure substantive rationality, when you look at them closely, don't seem all that pure. There's more distance and complication going on. We'll see that later. But what happens to substantive rationality? Why are we not living that way anymore? Well, one of the points that Weber makes, among others, is that this involves disenchanting nature. Because in a truly substantively rational world, nature speaks your social roles back to you. Nature is full of gods and spirits, personalities behind things, intentions which are being dictated to you by symbolism and religion and so on. You have to disenchant nature. No personalities behind things. Galileo says, no language of nature is mathematics. Not God's intention. I mean, there may be God who created mathematics, that's a different matter. But the language of nature is mechanics and mathematics, not spirits and intentions. Descartes says, matter is dumb, it doesn't have any intention or dynamism of its own. It's just mechanical stuff bouncing around. Animals are machines. Newton says, I can give you laws which will describe the use of the world, which will predict the orbit of the moon, the way the ball falls when you drop it to the ground, or the apple. What's happening then is that nature is becoming not just mechanical, but it's becoming divested of all that meaning that it had in the traditional society. And then Darwin comes off and says, and there's no purpose. Evolution is just goes along. We put that together, and of course this is what many people hate about this scientific picture of the world. It leaves you with a world that has no meaning. It doesn't offer you any guidance. It's disenchanted. And the trouble is it all works. You don't have to do magic. You don't have to pray. You just have to know how to fix your car. Right? Weber says, a man in Germany might not know how to build a steam engine for the locomotive that he rides to work. But he knows that that information is available if he needs it. Whereas in a traditional society, the shaman keeps the secrets. You're never going to know how things work. So part of what's going on here is transparency. Nature may be stripped of deep meaning. On the other hand, it's at least in principle available. We can improve on it. We can manipulate it. We proceed to do so, usually badly. But that's all right. It's up to us. Right? So that's the picture of the transition. Now, there's other social reasons for it, complicated causes, which he tries to talk about. For surprisingly, he thinks a big part of it is the Protestant Reformation, as you know. So that's what a substantively rational society is, and then it breaks down. Well, then what do you get? You get what he calls formal rationality. Formal rationality makes consistency and efficiency the only norms. There's no content to them. They're a form. Whatever goals you want, be consistent and efficient. See, it's formal. It's a formal criterion. Put the content in, make sure that it's consistent and efficient, go to it. No substantive restrictions. That's the distinction he's trying to make. Formal rationality in pursuing what goal? Whatever. Now, in fact, there's a problem there, and he knows because he's read his Nietzsche. That leads to a kind of nihilism. And he'll talk about that in a little bit. But in any case, formal rationality, at least for him, dictates no goal, which creates a great deal of freedom and a great deal of problem. That's the glory and the terror of modernity for Weber. Immense benefit. First, new possibilities, more possibilities. Secondly, fewer restrictions and a continual attempt to find out where there are restrictions and get rid of them. You know, well, we used to think you could have slaves, then we thought women were inferior, then we think, you know, growth of freedom, growth of justice. Also, it's more efficient. We use resources badly today, but more efficiently than some societies that wasted a lot of them on displays for the king and things like that. Now we have people who are trying to bring that back. That's another matter. So there's less oppression based on natural differences. We're still fighting that, but there is less of it. And we have rationally effective bureaucratic systems instead of the old rituals. We've unleashed productivity and innovation. That's all pretty positive stuff, right? There'll be more to say about the negative in a moment. Now, let's pause a moment. I want to take Weber's stuff about the transition from substantive to formal rationality and apply it to a theory from the 1950s by Walt Rostow of the path of development for nations. Okay? Here's his path. You start out with a traditional society, which is static, and people are confined by traditional role, which evolves, apparently under external pressure, to beginning to have commerce, exploitation of agriculture, breaking down of some of the fixed roles, builds up the right kind of infrastructure, develops a manufacturing sector, invests in it heavily, develops wider bases, begins to exploit international trade for comparative advantage, and then you get high mass consumption, modern, free society. What's not to like? Right. You go from this hidebound traditional society, you jog it a little bit, you help it to develop curiously as an image of ourselves, right? And then it becomes mature. Notice the word, maturity. It was immature, now it's mature. Now, there were lots of policies and programs based on this idea. And it often helped to have a local strongman to do it. Right? The Shah of Iran, Ataturk in Turkey. People who would push their society away from its traditional thing into the modern world. Right? What's not to like? What could possibly go wrong? People are getting freer, consumption is going up. What can be about? What's the problem? We call that development, which implies they were undeveloped, right? But there was something in there to be developed. Or sometimes we call it modernization, which suggests a change from the traditional to the modern. And sometimes they call it westernization, right? That they feel like something has been imposed upon them. I want to quote two sources here. Now, I should explain, there is a web page associated with these lectures. You can find it by going to my web page. My name is David Kolb, dkolb.org, and you'll see a link almost immediately to this web page, which has a series of quotations. Some of them you've already seen, others more description of what Weber's up to, and a long quote from the Susie Hansen book, and from the next one. The Susie Hansen book is very interesting. Susie is a journalist from New York who was getting a little bit disgruntled, and she got a scholarship to go abroad, and she went to Turkey. And she fell in love with various aspects of Turkish civilization. And then she was asked to cover various events in Turkey, and she began to realize there was an anti-modern protest going on in Turkey. It, of course, eventually developed into Erdogan stuff, which has its own problem. But what she was seeing was people who were feeling that Ataturk's leadership of secularizing Turkey and modernizing it had left them feeling empty somehow. They felt something had been lost. And it came to a head for her when she was asked to cover a miners' strike, because the miners were striking because of the mine had a very bad safety record, and the union was just a creature of the government, and the government was a creature of the corporation, which were part of an international thing. So they had no voice. And she was shocked by what she found. And she was asking all these questions. And one of the miners said to her, "Why did you never talk to us before? Only when this crisis came up." And she said, what that made her realize was that her attitude toward what she saw going on in Turkey was this: they're behind, we're ahead, they have to catch up, we already know the path, they have nothing to teach us, so I don't need to talk with them, I just need to chivvy them along the path. She calls this American innocence. And in a quote you'll see, she says, they say that the Vietnam War destroyed American innocence. They say the Gulf War destroyed American innocence. They say 9/11 destroyed American innocence. They say Donald Trump destroyed American innocence. American innocence is ineradicable. We're so convinced of ourselves, of our exceptionalism. And so the book is really a cry from the heart about why have I been blind? How do we get unblinded to see that the relationships between us and the societies we were trying to, quote, develop is much more complicated and much more two-way than we've let it be. So that's a very good book, and there's a long quote from it on the webpage. This is another good book, Pankaj Mishra. Mishra is an Indian, poor Indian who self-educated largely, works now in England. And the Hindu nationalist movement, Modi's movement in India, got him thinking about this problem of modernization. And then he began looking around at the other Asian states in China, Iran, and whatnot, and saying, everybody's angry. This was supposed to be a great liberation, this modernizing. But everybody seems pissed off. Everybody feeling bad. They're resentful. What's going on? So he has a number of interesting analyses, which lead him at one point to say, and I quote the paragraph, we need to update the Enlightenment. We need to redo it. And that's what I'm doing in these lectures, is trying to rethink going on. So the Mishra book is good. He writes columns for The Guardian. You may have seen them in that context. And the word he uses, which is taken from Nietzsche, is the French word ressentiment, resentment. Right. What are they resenting? Are they resenting our prosperity and freedom? Are they resenting the fact that maybe they won't be able to reach our level because we took all the resources? Are they resenting maybe the loss of something that we thought they could be better off without, and they don't think so? Are they thinking about oversimplification, that we're taking a very complex society and leveling it out and simplifying it, and in the process redefining individuals in a way that's not so good? So that's a good topic. So what I'm saying is, the modern society has not been so easy to spread, and when we do spread it, not everybody likes it. Well, are we that bad? Is this all just imperialism with a cute cover story? In a way, yes. But there are deeper issues here. Abroad, we have people in one or another jihad in various places. And one of the responses we get is, oh, they hate us for our freedom. And the response to that people make is, no, they hate us because we've done things to them. Which is true. But it's still true that there is something about our freedom that is bothering them. Because it's messing up their traditional life. So maybe the problem is tradition and modernity should not be opposed that way. So this is my thesis, as I mentioned earlier. There are two errors creeping in here. That identities are single ply, and that freedom means a separation of form from content. Now you have a little better sense of that. And also, we have troubles right here in River City, right? We've got people left behind. We've got Trumpistas blowing up the system. We've got David Brooks longing for a community that seems to have gone away. We have groups clinging to power, lots of them. We have empty lives of superconsumption. We have social conservatives trying to stop progress. So it's not so clear that we are in great shape domestically either. How are we doing on the time? Let's talk about some of the dangers of modernity and traditional society. Unleashed productivity and innovation, which loses traditional life patterns. Yeah, but at least the shoemaker is no longer confined to being a shoemaker. Yeah, but what does he do? He's a greeter at Walmart now. Yeah. We're free, we take nothing for granted. Freedom, but that means nowhere to stand. It's your own values, there's no guarantee. There's no values that can claim you. No values that say, this is what you should do. It all depends on what you choose, which in the end, because it's your choice, has no basis other than your choice, which seems in a way to trivialize your life. Or another way to put it, there's no connection to a meaningful world of nature beyond our choices. Right? Because that world has been disenchanted. And there's another problem. The rational, efficient, bureaucratic system applies to you. Human engineering. The dream was you'd be the modern master of the world. Free choice. The reality is you're one more item to be efficiently dealt with. Right? My identity is turned into a lifestyle choice from the identity supermarket. I try to make a rebellious statement. I produce a new fashion, a goth, and pretty soon that's just one more shelf in the lifestyle supermarket. That's been co-opted. This relates to something another German philosopher, Martin Heidegger, calls das Gestell, which translates a word meaning framework. It actually can also refer to like a bookcase. An imposition, a world where everything is available for use and consumption, no restriction. For exchange and substitution, in a depthless circulation, indifferently available, our individual freedom is being trivialized by the very free circulation that we thought would guarantee it. Heidegger, who had some Nazi sympathies, was dead set against modernity because he thought it lost the kind of grounding and meaning we need, though he didn't think you could get it in the traditional ways either. So he was pretty despairing. But this picture of technology and the world of freedom as feeling trivial and imposing upon us is the flip side of the picture of us being free with no restriction. Now, Weber himself thought that. His phrase was the iron cage of rationality. This is a quote from somebody else's slide. Increased rationalization traps individuals into systems based purely on efficiency and rational control. The polar night of icy darkness. And Weber said, can you avoid this? No. The process is too big, it's too social. All you can do, he says, is seek shelter in the few shrinking pockets of rich humanity that you can find while they're still there. Enjoy your elite culture. Do the reading. Go to the concerts. Talk with your friends in book groups. Meanwhile, this rationalization of nature will continue. Occasionally, there will be what he calls a disruptive, charismatic leader who will cause a change in the society. And then he says you will get what he calls the routinization of charisma, and that will go away, and the iron cage will descend again. So this is his Nietzschean side. So it's not very positive. Well, let's stop there before raising the question of trying to go back. Do you see what I'm trying to suggest here? That there's the modernity defined this way as a removal of traditional restrictions leads to, and we seem caught. We like to think, us Americans, that it's very positive, but when we look at the echo of ourselves in the foreign and the effects we see domestically, it's not so encouraging. Well, let's ask this question. I mean, if it's also, this is what Heidegger worried about. Could we go back? Could we have a rebuild the traditional society? Why not return to substantive rationality? Re-enchant nature, right? I use Sedona here as the, invoke quantum mechanics, the new world, the new physics, anything, Indian theories, new whatever, hidden dimensions, subtle energies, new religions, new ages, new times, whatever. Bring back mystery. Put intention and personality back into nature so that it speaks to us. Well, that way is not very encouraging. Weber says, the old religions will welcome you back with open arms, provided you make, quote, the intellectual sacrifice. And yeah, you can pay the price, but you have to turn off parts of yourself to do that. And the question is, can it be done without what Sartre calls bad faith? Can you have that lovely, innocent rejoicing in? Here's a point that Hegel makes. If you're going to repress something, get rid of it, you have to stay aware of it, oddly enough. You want to get it out of your life. If you're a deeply spiritual person, you don't want to think about the body anymore. But that means you have to be constantly alert that the body isn't creeping back into your spirituality. Far from leaving it behind, you have to constantly keep an eye on it over your shoulder. Right? Similarly here, if you want to forget that you chose to go away from modernity, you're going to have to keep policing the borders to make sure that nothing comes in to remind you of that. You're going to keep having to push your self-reflection aside.
Build a wall.
Build a wall. Or build an alternative culture, as some of the fundamentalist religious people have done. Build a culture that doesn't let those other voices reach people. Yeah. Modernity doesn't go away, you have to keep pushing it away. So if you're going to re-enchant nature, the anti-modern movements today are curiously modern. They're curiously self-aware because they have to be constantly pretending that they're not self-aware. Right? And there's some interesting discussions in Pankaj Mishra about the modernity of the anti-modern movements in Iran under Khomeini. Not just the technology that he used, but the whole technique that he was doing was kind of an inverse of Ataturk in Turkey. He was going to top-down redo the society in a sort of modernizing way, even though he was claiming to be anti-modern. Well, that brings us to the question. Is there some other way to mix and match? To get the benefits of the one without losing the benefits of the other? How can we avoid being torn between tradition and modernity? So here we are. Is there some way to mix and match traditional and modern? My suggestion is maybe they're not described correctly. Maybe we need better concepts that can open up the fixed opposition of individual and society, form and content. Talk about some of the tactics that people have been trying to use. One would be to just accept Weber's idea that values are arbitrary and just run with it. You know, find your passion and do it. Or you could try to find new substantive norms. One way would be to find a new religion. Lots of people do that. Or create a new religion. And in a way that's happening with people who are talking about evolution and saying, well, we have some values, not always very good ones, that have been programmed into us by natural selection. We're primates, you know, all that. And we have to deal with those values, except some of them are kind of nasty, so we have to reform them. It's not quite, well, does that come from evolution? Awkward. Then there's the people who use game theory, which is actually very promising. You can do abstract game theory analyses that argue that cooperation is better than competition and try to prove that that works in evolutionary terms. So there are people who are doing scientific things which may lead to new substantive norms. They all run up against the one problem, which is they prove maybe that that's what's going on, but it doesn't prove that it's what should go on. The so-called is-ought problem. Yeah, you can tell me what is, but should it be? Right? So looking for new norms in nature can be difficult, but there's a lot going on about that. Another possibility would be to look at procedural norms and say, maybe we could devise a better modern society if we took this notion of form without content and amplified the notion of what that form is and tried to find in some sort of social contract way what would count as a good society. John Rawls, the Harvard philosopher, took that route. And then there's the people who say, no, let's just do it in economic terms, right? Whether it's capitalist or another. Because there's something going on here that needs to be talked about, which is the relation between formal rationality and capitalism's purely economic person, which we'll come to later. So there are many attempts, other than Sedona, right, to find something more than just sheer arbitrary value, something that does tie into nature somehow. There's a lot going on there. But I'm going to bring in Hegel. Hegel's very good at rejecting tight dichotomies. That's sort of what he does professionally. A word about him. He died in 1831, actually, I think, not 1832. He was teaching at Berlin. He was born in Stuttgart. He was called by his college friends der Alte, the old guy, because he was always kind of serious and earnest. His writings are incredibly earnest. And he wanted to make philosophy speak German, and he failed. His writings are among the most difficult in the philosophical canon. I'm not going to subject you to them. They're very enlightening, and you wrestle with them, but it's a wrestling match. These lectures have a thesis. The debates about American identity are distorted, as I told you. And I'm going to invoke on this question of single-ply identity. That's what we're going to start with. Nice. This is a painting from a friend. Now, Hegel has a lot to say about modernity, and I'm only going to pick up two of these many things. The two in green, about new kinds of individuality and how you can deny purely formal modes of life. LW there is Ludwig Wittgenstein. He has interesting things to say about how a market society, purely economic capitalist society, relates to the larger substantive community that he calls the state. So the capitalist moment and the French moment. He has interesting things about what it means to be an individual, and he would argue that to be an individual is a social process, a social product. And he talks about how states have different spirits, which we may come back to later. So there's lots of things we could talk about. We're going to talk about those first two. In green. Now, one thing about Hegel, he's famous for talking about historical dialectic, the path reaching a totality, like the golden yellow brick road that you follow. You know, it's all necessary. It just has to come out. And curiously enough, it comes out with him, which is not silly given his theory, but it's implausible. We're going to put that aside. What we're going to do is look, though, at his history. I'm going to talk about changes in the notion of what it means to be an individual. Okay? I'm going to start with Achilles here and go one step further, and then we'll take questions, all right? Think about Achilles. Remember in the Iliad, Achilles gets angry because he's captured this maiden, Briseis, and Agamemnon takes her away. Presumably, he's not mad because he's being deprived of some sexual object. He's probably got 100 other maidens, and he may be bisexual anyway. What he's mad about is that his honor has been affected. His honor has been affected. Right? Now you say, wait a minute, Achilles, it's no big deal. You've got 50 other maidens here. You, down in your deep identity, are not affected by the fact that Agamemnon is the bully. And Achilles said, no, my honor is my identity. I am a warrior. Who I am in bed with the maidens, that's trivial. But who I am, if I'm going to live up to who I am, is the warrior. We're talking about a society here, and there's an interesting quote from Peter Berger, which I've put on the webpage. In a society with honor, think about King Arthur's story. Guinevere and Lancelot have an affair, right? And you want to say, Lancelot has finally gotten in touch with his true self in bed with Guinevere. But no, that's exactly wrong. His true self was his role as the knight. Right? In the society of honor, a society that defines you by your social role, what you do privately, in bed, sexually, or gastronomically, or whatever, is not important, and it can mess up your true self. His true self is to ride out fighting, just as Achilles' true self is to go ahead and destroy Troy. Right? You might say, there's no distance between Achilles and his social role. He doesn't have any way to reflect on it. He may have thought, at times, I don't like this being a warrior stuff. But it doesn't matter. There's no place in his society for him to do anything with that reflection. Right? So he's stuck. Not from his point of view. Right? Peter Berger said, the conception of the naked self, outside of institution and social role, the deep reality of human being, is the very heart of modernity. And this is a quote from Berger, of a relation of it. In a world of honor, the individual discovers his identity in his role. Turn away from the roles is to turn away from himself. In a world of dignity, individual dignity, the individual can only discover his identity by getting away from roles. Those are masks. Achilles would say, it's not a mask, that's what I have to live up to. Now Hegel says that kind of society, Achilles' society, breaks down. And here's the example he uses. This is Sophocles' tragedy Antigone. Two sisters, they are the daughters of Oedipus. This happens after Oedipus King has had his tragedy and has left the city. His uncle, Creon, has taken over as king. There are other sons who attack the city to try and take over. They are killed in battle. One was defending the city, one was attacking it. Creon, as the king, very sensibly said, the son, the brother who died defending the city will be given full honors. The brother who attacked the city, trying to destroy the city, his body will be left to rot out there, and the birds of the air can come and eat it, which means he won't get the rituals that are supposed to release his spirit. Right? So it's not just dishonor it, they're going to try and muck up his afterlife. Right? Now the two sisters, Antigone and Ismene, are suddenly put in a conflict between two of their social roles. One as a citizen, they should obey the king, and one as a family member whose obligation is to safeguard the members of the family and the connection with the ancestors. You can't leave your brother to rot. Antigone realizes this is a problem. She tries to persuade Ismene to go along with it. Ismene refuses. Antigone goes at night and performs basic rituals, pouring water and sprinkling things on the body. She's caught. Creon says, you can't do this. You're a citizen. She says, I'm following the unwritten law of the family and so on. Conflict between two kinds of law, the written law and the unwritten law. Or to put another way, two kinds of social roles. The natural one of the family and the social one set up by the king. Hegel's point is, look, something new has happened here that wouldn't happen to Achilles. There are conflicts implicit in the society, different social roles, which are now brought into open conflict in this example. Suddenly there's room for Antigone to choose between those social roles, and she chooses one, but she can never be fully identified with either one again. Right? And what happens then, of course, is tragedy ensues in various ways. But the point Hegel's making is a society like the one Achilles is living in has inside it internal tensions which can come out to the surface under varying circumstances, and the tragedy is one of them, which provide for a new kind of individuality that does not identify with the social role. Antigone chooses. I mean, she says that she has to just follow her family, but of course she's choosing, and Ismene chooses otherwise. So you have an example here where some kind of distance has been introduced between the individual and the social role. All right? The next step, of course, is going to be, as you can guess, Socrates, who explicitly says, hey guys, let's think about our social roles and decide if they're any good. Let's decide whether or not they're really valid, whether they have any foundation, whether the values that we're supposed to be following are really true values. Now you've got somebody who's explicitly doing the thing that's sort of implicit in Antigone and Ismene. He's just coming right out and saying it. And what happens? He gets executed, right? Because there's no official place in his society for people to say things like that, especially at the end of a war and all the circumstances that he was living through. So, but you see what Hegel is saying. Distance is being introduced, and it's being made more explicit, and the society is going to have to find a way to cope with it. And what happens as we go on, which let's do next time, is to see various ways where it gets coped with more and more. And what I'm going to suggest is our notion of identity has to include that notion of distance in a certain complicated way, which will give us a more flexible notion of identity, which will change our notion of modernity a bit. So, that's enough snow falling on the land for now. What about questions? What about what you hear? What about questions? What about what you hear? Well, there's two ways to handle that. One is to say, well, we just aren't there yet. We've got the principles, we just have to make them happen. If there's people who are not restricted, then give them resources, free them up. You know, I mean, that's basically the strategy that's being used. And the other is to say, maybe this contentless freedom is not so contentless, and it has something about it which is restricting them. And maybe you can't just wipe out the content. Maybe there's some more complicated maneuvers that are needed. One of the issues that's buried there is the question of whether or not this modern freedom is economic only, or whether there's other kind. And that we're going to have to talk about more. As I said, it's very tempting to say that the Weber's purely formally rational, do what you want, efficient citizen is the same as the economist's purely economic, maximize utility, take only economic factors into account. But they aren't the same.
We have 7 different identities. 25 years in the future, 40% of the jobs are going to be taken over by robots.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that question about who we really are is much, much more important, and it's going to get more important with time.
Mm-hmm. I agree. One of the thing about your identity belonging defined by your job. I mean, as I said, you can picture Achilles at his tent at night saying, this hero business is really kind of tiring. But there's nowhere he can go with that. He can make a joke, but that's about all he can do. There's another story it's also a play by Sophocles, a hero named Ajax, who is terribly embarrassed by an event which he fell into because he was misled by a god. I mean, it wasn't his fault. But it left him, he thought he was killing Trojans and he was killing cattle on the beach. And people are laughing at him. So he killed himself. Right? Because his identity has been challenged, even though it wasn't, quote, his fault. Right? There was no room for him to laugh at himself. And one of the things that happens in our society is you begin to create social roles for that. The critic, the ironic commentator, the poet. There are social places where you can laugh, where you can do that distance and people will approve of it, right? Which didn't exist. There's some wonderful, when I was studying Latin, a guy brought in some poetry from the Middle Ages, which took very pious Christian hymns and mocked them. And there's one that's in the Carmina Burana that talks about drinking. One drinks 1,000 drinks and so on, which is word for word a mock on a poem about the Eucharist that's very serious. Well, they could do that up to a point. Right? There was already room for that. We have more room. And indeed, one of the things Hegel worries about is we have too much room. People can just back off completely. We'll look at that later. So yeah, being defined by your job isn't going to work, partly because the job is too narrow, partly because you've got the distance from it, and partly because the job isn't going to be there. But then if it's not going to be there, what do? Now, Karl Marx, in one of his visionary statements, of which there are actually very few, talking about what might happen after the communist revolution, he says, once capitalism has developed reductive resources tremendously, when there's a bunch of abundance for everybody, that's what capitalism is supposed to do for Marx, create abundance. And then new social relationships are supposed to arise in the midst of that. Once that's true, you're always going to have what he calls the realm of necessity. I mean, there's just some sort of jobs that are going to have to be done. You can put robots onto most of them, but probably not all of them. Mining, garbage collection, what have you. But he says, you'll be free to be a hunter in the morning, a poet in the afternoon, a critical critic at night. Right? In other words, he's imagining that you have multiple identities, very fluid, because you have all this freedom. People mocked him for that, probably rightly so. But the point is legitimate. If you had a realm of tremendous abundance, where nobody had to work just to get along, where the social product was being distributed to people freely by somehow or other, what would you do with your life?
Would you consider these concepts a product of Western thought or universal?
Mostly Western. The question was, are the concepts we've been talking about inherently Western concepts? Certainly given the context from Greeks and Hegel and whatnot, yes. Then you have to ask how they jive with concepts from other traditions, and that's not easy. It requires another deep investigation. But for the moment, since the Westerns have been imposing their concepts all over the world, it makes sense to talk about them that way. But yeah, it may not be enough in the long run.
Yesterday, in the presentation on gender and fascism, it was described as the situation after or during World War I and then after World War I of economic distress in Germany and rebuilding of Europe led the stage to pretty much the kind of dichotomy you're talking about, the rural divide of formality and conservatism that led rise to Hitler. And then, of course, the modern social changes that are presented in the movie Cabaret, Come to the Cabaret.
Mm-hmm.
So are you seeing the same parallels? Is that kind of what you're describing?
Yes, and indeed Weber is living through that, living in the First World War time. Yes, precisely.
Gail?
Well, I'm just reflecting on roles and where we all are in our life. Haven't our roles changed? I feel that retirement is wonderful, but where is my roadmap for my own identity?
Mm-hmm. What kind of roadmap do you want? I mean, that's part of what the question is, right?
Exactly.
Again, I was just interested in your in vocabulary here that we see around the question of meaning of life and where does that come from. And I noted that several of the philosophers referred to religions, old religion, religious belief, nature, the interest in what nature can teach us. And I'm wondering, are we to assume in that meaning for life thing that the concept not of given religion, but of God is not present at all in any of these thinkers?
It's a complicated question because it has a lot of dimensions. If they're influenced by Nietzsche, no, of course not. Because Nietzsche feels God is dead. And by well, he doesn't just mean that people don't believe in God, because they still may. He means that the highest values are no longer authoritative. Hegel claimed he was a pious Christian, but his God was a pretty abstract one. And you could also say it was pretty atheistic. The problem with invoking God is this. If you say your meaning of life has been given to you by God, there's one question that sounds weird: how did he come up with it? Right? But that's not silly, because there was a huge fight in the late Middle Ages, and also happened in Islam, between people who said God is all wise and he could know the best thing for you, and the people who said God is powerful and free and he's not going to be restricted by something given like a list of the best thing. So there was a question, as they put it in those days: is it God's will or his intellect? Is God, here's a very concrete way to put it. Could God create a world where 2 + 2 = 5? That is to say, in creating the world, was God bound by the rules of mathematics? Which is a normal thing people would say, because they're mathematics, I mean, what the hell? Or, as Descartes would say, and as Newton would say, the rules of mathematics were created by God. He could have changed them. Thank goodness he didn't, because they're fairly neat. You know? But he was not bound by them. In which case, you've put God in the position of this freely choosing creator, and you can just say, oh, God has given me this role. Why? I can no longer trust that he chose it because it was the best, because he's got this incredible freedom. And I'm just dealing with some guy with a big stick who's telling me what to do. You know? So the theology debates and this question about freedom infected them. And in fact, the notion of the modern totally free individual is a secularized version of the totally free God, historically. So invoking God is tricky depending on what God you invoke. The Calvinist God is a God you just have to obey because he's got a big stick. The Thomist God supposedly knows what's best. But that means that he himself is subject to certain law, which some people think is fine, some people think not. Does that help?
Yes, now my mind is about to explode.
Oh. But the point is,
That was really excellent.
the point is that the problem between substantive and formal shows up on the divine level too.
I never encountered that before.
Yeah.
Andy? Yes, I was wondering, thinking about the concept of freedom and how that relates to liberty. It seems to me freedom is sort of what we think of as defined individuals, and liberty is more social, how we negotiate freedoms among groups.
Mm-hmm. That's one way to distinguish them. The terms are not necessarily distinct. Different people use them in different ways. I was tempted at one point when I was researching this to invoke the national anthem of Venezuela, which is Gloria bravo pueblo que el yugo lanzó. Glory to the people who threw off the yoke of Spain. Right? That was the first country that Bolivar freed. Right? And they're defining their freedom as throwing off, literally, a yoke, like the thing you'd use to make an ox pull a cart. That's the conception of freedom, and which is very different from the freedom of self-direction, though it implies the coming to that. And when you say how you negotiate among free individuals, that's a huge can of worms. And where this is going in the long run, once we have a more flexible notion of identity, it raises the question of multiculturalism. How do you live in a society where there isn't just one set of values? You're going to need a double-ply notion of identity at that point. So you want to be able to say there are certain values I feel committed to, but, and then how you flesh that out. And at that point, I'm going to bring in two characters. One is John Rawls, who thinks he can find a way to create a sort of universal notion of the second level identity. And the other is a German jurist called Carl Schmitt, who said, no, universal identities are fragile, they fall apart. The only way you get a true political identity is if there's something you'll die for and something you hate. Which means you can't have a multicultural society. Yeah. He was a Nazi.
Yeah.
But his critique of liberalism is very powerful and needs to be confronted.
These philosophers could not, I don't think, and didn't figure in the future of artificial intelligence.
No.
If they could, how would that have, if they could have foreseen that, how would that have changed their philosophy?
I don't think we know because we don't know what that future will be. I read a lot of science fiction, and there's so many different versions of what AI could come to that it's one fears to tread there. At the moment, it's sort of like, I mean, the best examples we have at the moment are the chess players who use the chess playing programs to help them. Somebody had an interesting example, though. Think about the wayfaring programs you have on Google Maps, like Waze and other things, which will tell you how to avoid traffic problems, give you a different route. Well, let's suppose that the big computers at Google Maps suddenly realize that there's all these different people trying to avoid a traffic mix-up. And they know where they're trying to go, and some people that the computer thinks are more important than others. Suddenly, instead of just saying, okay, you go that way, they're apportioning it. They're saying, you get in the traffic jam because what they're trying to do is more important. So what starts out as a simple advice program suddenly begins to push people around. I think that's the way it's going to develop dangerously. That we're saying, oh yes, we really love this help. Oh, it's decided I'm not as important as that car over there. You know, and of course you can magnify that example. And that much I think we can say, and I don't think we know what to do about it. But it's, the reason that that's a good example is we're cheerfully letting them do it. Right.
A segue to that is that there seems to be some little thought that this yellow vest uprising in France has continued because of the perhaps Russian or other interference on the internet as it was during our election. So this is exactly the kind of thing you just mentioned with women.
Yeah.
We don't know how much it's influencing the world.
That's right, and it's very scary. And we need better surveillance of what's going on. And there's a lot of interests trying to make sure we don't have it. Yes, it's very scary. I mean, that's another thing. You can talk about in grandiose terms about, oh, the development of computers, the programs going on. But there's also concrete political powers, people trying to maintain positions, which are actively working against some of these things, or pushing them in a bad way. Yeah.
Okay, so this is kind of scattered, but we need more women in the AI in order to help balance the goals, I think.
True.
But Achilles' wake up, fictitious that you're imagining he had, reminded me of Betty Friedan's wake up call in the middle of the night.
Yes.
And she suddenly said, wait a minute,
Mm-hmm.
that's all there is.
Yeah,
So
Betty
that was a
Friedan.
long stretch of time between those two things.
Yes, but it's the same thing. Distance from your role suddenly becomes possible. Yeah. And we have to find ways to create more of that.
It seems to me that throughout history there have been certain people who just sat around and thought about these kind of problems, and there were those that realized that everything that they could think about was coming from the head on their shoulders, and everything they knew had to be inputted there first and then outputted, and reached conclusions that awareness was all that was important. Will we ever get beyond that?
Well, what Hegel would say is what we have to do is create new social roles that allow those awarenesses to be implemented properly. You have to make space for that. I mean, one of the things I'm going to say is, look, all through history, people have had these thoughts, I really want to be a lawyer. Geez, lawyer stuff is really sucks. Or the women's roles is really lousy in my society. But nothing happens because there's no social accepted way to do anything with that. It's just a joke, or it's a sickness, or it's a passing fancy. What you need to do is create institutions that take that seriously and open up the possibility for action based on it. So that's more than just awareness.
David?
Yeah.
No. That it's living in a universe of water until you take it out.
Yeah.
Is freedom defined by what we lose or by what we gain? It seems to me we have a bundle of rights, a bundle of activities that we do. Take them away, and we suddenly have become aware of what we're losing.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, all we want to do in that situation is get back to the zero-sum game. If we defined freedom as something we gain, then I think it's limitless.
Mm-hmm. It's certainly true that the awareness of restriction can cause one to struggle to get out from under it. But even that awareness requires an awareness, the space to have that awareness. And if you define freedom in terms of gain, that's good. Gain from what to what, right? Eventually, you're going to have to do more than define freedom negatively. Right? Because if you define freedom purely negatively, somewhat the way Weber ends up doing, you end up with this arbitrary world and no guidance. But if you define freedom in some more creative way, as the opening up of new possibilities based on where you're at, say, or on moving from the current to a wider situation, or something like that, then we try to put the two together that you're talking about. But because we always are, in fact, in a mixture. We're never in the pure, Sartrean freedom. You know, Jean-Paul Sartre has a famous example of a man walking along a cliff and being very afraid, not because he might slip and fall over the cliff, but because he cannot guarantee that in the next 5 minutes he will not decide to throw himself off the cliff. Right. Sartre gets caught for various philosophical reasons in this, that nothing in the past conditions the future whatsoever unless we choose to have it do so, which means that we're always guilty when we let things continue. But if we don't let them continue, we are empty freedom with no guidance whatsoever. And he can't handle that. He wants to find a way to get out of that trap, but his concepts don't allow him to. And we have to avoid that trap of saying that our choice is between being totally determined or totally free, because it's a mix. And we'll try to come to some concepts that embody that.
Isn't there also, don't we eternally ask ourselves the question, is this all there is? It comes up again and again in life.
It does. Whether the people always did it, I don't know the answer to that. Although if you look at a lot of myths about people running into trouble with the gods, probably so. And we're never going to have a good answer to that.
It seems like we're going to have to eventually come to the point where there are universals. So there's always a struggle between good and evil. There's always the search for truth, the search for knowledge. And so couldn't we use those things to define ourselves?
Yes, but it takes more content to them than that. Some procedural issues and some problems of defining what counts as truth and so on. Yes, that's the sort of thing John Rawls will do when he's trying to develop a universal picture of commitment. And then sort of Schmidt is going to fight that. But Rawls, it seems to me, leaves it too empty. We have to have a double level notion of identity that he doesn't have full.
David, you certainly have opened up a whole wide way of thinking.
Sorry.
About human freedoms, who we are after we have left a role, that role being whatever we were as a career person and so on, and then freedom. And I would just like to share with you a quote that was one of my husband's favorites before he passed away. And it was about freedom, and I think it fits into what we're talking about. And I'm going to read it because I probably will mix it up if I don't. It's from Viktor Frankl, the Austrian philosopher and psychologist. And he says, everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. And somehow that's resonating with me as you're speaking today and talking about who are we, freedom, and so on and so forth. And I don't know if you have any insight into that.
I think that's a wonderful quote, but I would add that freedom to choose one's way is enmeshed in history in a way that has to be analyzed further. You may notice, you know, I have Parkinson's disease, and so you see my face doing funny things and my hands shaking and all that. I wrote an essay about having Parkinson's disease. It's on my website. And I came to using quotes like that as having to deal